Blake Lively seems to be making a very deliberate move right now to shift the entire conversation. And honestly, if you've been watching this situation closely, the timing is hard to ignore. After weeks of non-stop legal tension, court filings stacking up, lawyers trading arguments, headlines exploding across every outlet, and the public picking apart every detail of the Baldoni-related dispute, something very different suddenly appears in the spotlight. Warm, almost carefully curated couple content. Soft, happy images. Ryan Reynolds casually showing off his physique. Blake framing herself as his biggest supporter, reacting to him like everything is light, playful and perfect. And maybe it is genuine. Maybe she really did look at those photos and think nothing more than admiration for her husband. But when you've followed celebrity media cycles long enough, you start to recognize when the rhythm changes. Because just as the legal storm intensifies behind the scenes, the public-facing narrative starts looking almost too polished, almost too perfectly timed. And here's where things actually get more serious than the Instagram posts suggest. There's a new legal filing now in play, and it's not being talked about enough in mainstream coverage. On Monday, both legal teams are heading back into court again, this time to argue over attorney fees and whether a specific California statute can even be applied to Blake's position in the first place. It sounds technical, almost boring on the surface, the kind of legal detail most people scroll past without a second thought. But beneath that dry surface is where the real tension sits. Because this isn't just about money yet. It's about eligibility. It's about whether the legal foundation she's relying on even applies to her case at all. And that is exactly why Monday matters so much. Lawyers across California are reportedly watching this closely, because whatever direction the judge leans in could quietly influence how similar cases are handled in the future. And speaking of the judge, there's already a sense of fatigue building in the courtroom. According to what's been reported, the judge seems increasingly frustrated with how drawn out everything has become. And it's not hard to understand why. Imagine months of filings, amendments, responses, counter-responses, high-profile attorneys on both sides, and constant media attention turning every procedural step into a public spectacle. At this point, the message coming from the bench feels almost blunt. Stop overcomplicating it. Keep it tight. Keep it simple. No long-winded legal essays. No overstuffed arguments. Just get to the point. It's as if the court is trying to pull this entire case back down to earth after it's been stretched into something far bigger than a normal legal dispute. But here's the part that nobody really says out loud. Even a small procedural win in a case like this can be turned into a massive narrative shift. If Blake's side manages to secure even a narrow advantage, the headlines won't frame it as minor or technical. They'll amplify it. One victory becomes major breakthrough. A procedural ruling becomes turning point. The optics matter almost as much as the ruling itself, sometimes even more. And that brings everything back to social media. Because right around the same time the legal pressure is building, Blake posts something completely different in tone. A relaxed, sunlit moment with Ryan Reynolds. He's holding cookies and berries, casual and unbothered, while the entire post feels like a quiet snapshot of domestic normality. And then Blake does something very intentional in how she frames it. She zooms in on him. Not the setting. Not the food. His arms. His presence. His image. And instantly the focus shifts. Instead of courtrooms and filings, the conversation becomes about affection, about admiration, about a couple appearing completely unshaken. It feels almost too perfectly placed in the middle of everything else happening behind the scenes. Then things take an even stranger turn. Several entertainment outlets publish coverage of that same Instagram post almost immediately. On the surface, that's normal. Celebrity media moves fast. But when you place those articles side by side, something starts to stand out in a way that's hard to ignore. The structure feels nearly identical. The phrasing echoes itself. The details appear in the same order. One mentions the cookies. Another repeats the same detail. One highlights the arm focus. Another mirrors it almost line for line. Even the way the captions are described, even the way the tone is framed, feels like it's been pulled from a shared template. And that's when it starts to feel less like independent reporting and more like coordinated repetition, where the same narrative is being echoed across multiple platforms with only slight variations to disguise it. Of course, in the world of celebrity PR, this isn't unheard of. Publicists regularly guide coverage, shape messaging, and steer attention toward specific angles. Controlling the story is part of the industry. Influencing perception is part of the game. But the moment it becomes too visible, it stops feeling invisible. And once people start noticing the pattern itself becomes the story. What makes it even more interesting is how differently the outlets treat the legal situation compared to the lifestyle content. In some coverage, the lawsuit is barely mentioned at all, almost pushed to the background as if it's unrelated noise. Meanwhile, the personal images are amplified, expanded, and softened into something far more dominant than the courtroom reality. And that contrast is exactly what keeps this entire situation so tightly watched. Because on one side, there's a legal battle moving through technical arguments and procedural decisions. And on the other side, there's a carefully shaped public image unfolding in real time, polished just enough to redirect attention whenever it drifts too close to the courtroom. The controversy itself is barely acknowledged in some corners of the media. Yet in another report, the reminder is much sharper, pulling readers straight back to the reason Blake Lively has been dominating headlines in the first place. And that's where the tension really builds, because no matter how many polished couple photos circulate online, the legal situation doesn't disappear. It lingers, still being followed, still being debated, still shaping opinions in the background. And through all of it, Blake appears focused on projecting something very specific: calm, control, and confidence. The message feels almost impossible to miss. Look at me. Look at Ryan Reynolds. Look at our life. Look at the smiles, the chemistry, the ease. Look at how untouched we seem by everything swirling around us. Because like it or not, Blake has always understood how attention works. She knows image is power. And in moments like this, perception can become just as valuable as any courtroom outcome. The real question isn't simply whether the timing of these stories is intentional or coincidental. The real question is why this particular version of events is being highlighted right now. Why focus on the physique, the light-hearted couple moments, the carefully framed happiness? Why this exact week, right as another key legal hearing approaches? In Hollywood, timing rarely feels random, and Blake Lively has spent long enough inside that system to understand how quickly narratives can be shaped, shifted, and redirected. And honestly, once you start examining the timing closely, everything begins to feel a little more layered than it first appeared. Because while audiences were busy reacting to Ryan Reynolds' appearance and analyzing every detail of Blake's posts, another part of the story was unfolding in the background, one that carries far more weight than any social media moment: the actual courtroom battle. And that is where things become significantly more serious, because Blake isn't just seeking attorney fees as a simple procedural request. She's also positioning herself within a legal argument tied to a California statute that has become one of the central points in this entire dispute. That's what makes the upcoming Monday hearing so important. The judge isn't just deciding financial responsibility. He's being asked to interpret whether the law itself applies in the way her team is arguing. And that distinction could echo far beyond this single case. It could influence how similar disputes are handled in the future, especially those involving retaliation claims and workplace conflict arguments. That's much bigger than anything happening on Instagram. And this is exactly why some observers believe there's a parallel strategy unfolding alongside the legal one. Because almost every time court documents surface, another lighter, more controlled narrative appears shortly after. When legal headlines begin gaining traction, suddenly the focus shifts toward lifestyle, relationships, or public appearances. It creates a split attention effect, where one storyline competes with another for public focus. And that's not accidental in how modern celebrity culture operates. Most people aren't reading filings or legal breakdowns at night. They're scrolling feeds. They're looking at images. They're absorbing headlines in seconds. And that is where perception quietly takes shape. Another moment that sparked discussion recently was Blake's public presence at a major fashion event, where online speculation spiraled in every direction. Some users claimed there was tension behind her invitation. Others suggested she was being distanced from certain circles entirely. Then, almost immediately, a wave of coverage appeared painting a very different picture. She was welcomed. She was confident. She was relaxed. She was positioned among familiar faces, smiling, composed, and fully present in the moment. And that's where the narrative split becomes obvious. One version suggests uncertainty. The other projects stability. One raises questions. The other answers them before they're even fully formed. And in an industry built on perception, that contrast becomes powerful. Because if enough people are shown the same version of a story, even subtly repeated across different platforms, it starts to feel like the only version that exists. And whether that reflects reality perfectly or not becomes almost secondary to how widely it is believed. At the same time, online reactions have started digging much deeper than recent events. Old interviews have resurfaced. Archived clips are being replayed. Past comments, once harmless and forgotten, are being reinterpreted through the lens of current controversy. A casual remark from years ago suddenly feels loaded. A light interview moment is now dissected for meaning it was never originally intended to carry. And that's something the internet consistently does once attention turns. Doesn't just move forward. Circles backward. It reopens everything. It reevaluates everything. And it builds new narratives from old fragments, whether fair or not. But stepping away from Blake for a moment, another story began unfolding almost simultaneously, pulling attention in an entirely different direction. Tom Hardy. And this situation escalated quickly in a way few expected. Early reports suggested he had been removed from a major production following internal disagreements behind the scenes. That alone would have been enough to spark conversation. But then, just as quickly, a second wave of reports arrived challenging that version entirely, suggesting the situation was far less final than initially described. Suddenly the story shifted again. Was he out? Was he still involved? Was there internal pressure? Were other names being pulled into the situation? And just like that, speculation started spreading faster than any confirmed detail could catch up to it. Then suddenly, the conversation takes a sharp turn into politics, almost as if social media collectively couldn't resist pulling everything into a wider cultural argument. And that's usually where things stop making sense. Because once online discourse gets involved, confusion rarely stays contained. It multiplies, mutates. It turns speculation into something far louder than the original facts ever were. Tom Hardy, for his part, has carried a certain reputation in the industry for years. Even his supporters would describe him as highly talented, deeply committed, intense in his process, and at times unpredictable or difficult to work with. And depending on who you ask, those same traits can sound like praise or criticism. It all depends on perspective. According to circulating reports, some of the alleged friction on set was tied to production delays, repeated script adjustments, creative disagreements, and long pauses while he prepared for specific scenes. None of that is unusual in film production on its own, but when it gets repeated and reframed online, it quickly becomes something larger than it actually is. And this is where things take an uncomfortable and somewhat unfair direction. Because as discussions continued, certain online voices began dragging Helen Mirren into the narrative. And honestly, it's hard to see how that connection formed so abruptly. One moment people were discussing general production tension. The next, she was being positioned by some commenters as a central figure in a supposed behind-the-scenes conflict that had very little clear evidence supporting it. Some users started suggesting that political differences between actors were the real cause of tension, as if every disagreement in Hollywood must secretly hide a deeper ideological war. As though scheduling issues, creative disagreements, or simple workplace friction couldn't possibly exist on their own. Theories began stacking on top of each other, each more elaborate than the last, and yet they spread faster than any grounded explanation could catch up. Meanwhile, actual evidence being shared painted a very different picture. Photos showing cordial interactions. Public statements expressing respect. Past interviews highlighting positive working relationships. None of it seemed to slow the narrative once it had already taken hold online. Because once a theory becomes popular enough, facts don't always have equal weight in the conversation anymore. One of the more grounded perspectives that surfaced suggested that Helen Mirren, known for her directness, simply communicated openly when issues arose on set. And in truth, that's hardly unusual in a professional environment. If schedules are running late or plans keep shifting, frustration tends to surface eventually. That's not conflict in any dramatic sense. That's just people working under pressure. From everything that emerged, it sounded far more like standard workplace tension than some hidden industry conspiracy. Because realistically, if anyone has ever sat through repeated delays or last-minute changes during a long shoot day, they know how quickly patience can wear thin. That doesn't turn people into enemies. Just makes them human. What becomes interesting, though, is how differently that behavior gets interpreted depending on who is involved. When male actors are described in similar situations, the language often shifts toward admiration. Passionate, intense, perfection-driven, artistic. But if the roles were reversed, would the same descriptions still apply so comfortably? Or would the framing change entirely? That imbalance in perception is something the industry still hasn't fully resolved. And just as that conversation starts to settle, another headline appears out of nowhere, pulling attention in a completely different direction, almost like a reset button for chaos. Brad Pitt. At first, it sounded like just another celebrity business story, something routine involving branding or endorsements. But it escalated in a way few people expected. Because suddenly, the discussion wasn't just about a product launch or a naming disagreement. It was about a legal dispute involving one of the most unexpected and oddly specific consumer markets imaginable. Yes, a lawsuit connected to a penis cream company. And honestly, the reaction online was exactly what you'd expect. Confusion, disbelief, and a lot of people double-checking the headline just to make sure they hadn't misread it. Because on the surface, it raises a very simple question. What does Brad Pitt have to do with any of this? As it turns out, quite a bit, at least according to the claims being made. Brad Pitt's skincare venture, which otherwise fits neatly into the long list of celebrity beauty brands, has allegedly become entangled in a naming dispute. Another company claims that the branding used by Pitt's line is too close to their own established identity, creating grounds for legal action. Normally, that kind of trademark argument would already be enough to draw lawyers into a drawn-out corporate battle. But what makes this situation so bizarre is the nature of the other company involved. Reportedly, they operate in a very niche luxury wellness space focused on highly personal men's skincare products, specifically designed for intimate use. And that's where the absurdity of the situation really starts to set in. On one side, you have a globally recognized film star with a mainstream skincare brand. On the other, a niche company operating in a highly specialized market. And somewhere between those two worlds, a naming conflict has escalated into formal legal proceedings. According to reports, the company claims multiple attempts were made to resolve the issue privately before legal action was taken. They are now seeking damages and further legal remedies through the courts. Meanwhile, representatives for Brad Pitt have remained largely silent publicly, showing little interest in engaging with or addressing the more unusual headlines circulating around the dispute. And so, once again, Hollywood finds itself in a familiar position, a mix of serious legal questions, unexpected narratives, and online commentary that turns even the strangest details into viral spectacle almost instantly.